In this lesson, we're going to talk about evaluating functions. We're going to evaluate functions from an equation, from a graph, and from a table. So evaluating functions means to figure out how to complete an ordered pair. They're going to ask you using the notation f of x. And so we've got to evaluate the function for the given value in the parentheses. They're going to give you the x value. We've got to figure out the y value. Okay? Sometimes that will involve substitution, where we replace the variable and then we simplify something. And sometimes we just have to look at a graph or a table and find the matching value. So let's get started. Here we have several different types of equations that we can evaluate. Each time, remember that this is f of x notation. And so when they give you something like this, they're telling us to evaluate this function when x equals -4. Okay? So see how the -4 is in the same spot that the x is? That's because we're going to replace the x with -4. So this first one would say f of -4 equals 5, and then instead of x plus 7, we're going to say -4. So then I can simplify that piece. That would become a -20 plus 7, which would become a -13. So we can say that f of -4 is -13. So we're just plugging in the value and simplifying. Let's look at the second one. Again, we're evaluating this function for f of -4, which means that x is going to equal -4. So f of -4 equals x squared minus 7, but remember, instead of x, we're putting -4. Oops. So -4 squared is positive 16, and 16 minus 7 is 9. So we can say that f of -4 for this function is 9. Let's look at the next one. F of x is, there's two x's in this one. And so that means we're going to say that for both of those x's, we're substituting -4 because we're still evaluating f of -4. So I can say f of -4 equals -4 squared minus 3 times -4 plus 4. If we simplify all that, -4 squared is 16. -3 and -4 is a positive 12, and then plus 4. Keep simplifying. 16 plus 12 would be 28, plus 4 would be 32. So f of -4 for this function would be 32. Okay? It's just simply plugging in the values and simplifying the function. A lot of this is calculator work, actually. Let's look at using a table. Now you can see here, this is a function g of x. Okay? So these values here are your input values, and this is your output. So we're looking here for g of -2. That means that we're looking for where x is -2. So we've got to look down the x column to find -2. Found it right here. What's our output value when x is -2? 7. So we can say that g of -2 equals 7. Let's try it for the second one. G of -4 means that x equals what? negative 4. So I've got to look down the column. Again, we're looking down the x column, right, for negative 4. Found it right here. So what's my output value? 1. So we can say that g of negative 4 equals 1. Why don't you try the last one? Evaluate g of 2. So this is saying that x equals 2. We looked down the x column for the value of 2, found it right here. What's the output value? Negative 2. So we would say that g of positive 2 is negative 2. These ones are probably my favorite because they're that simple. Let's look at it from a graph. These ones can be kind of confusing, but it's the same idea. We just have to remember that this time our input values are all of those vertical lines across the graph, and our output values would be the points. So here we're looking at this first one, h of negative 6, which means that we're looking at where x is negative 6. So we've got to count over along our x-axis from 0 over to negative 6. So remember, that goes to the left. So here's negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6. So I'm looking for where the graph crosses that line, which would be right here, right? So my x value is negative 6. That point right there is negative 6 comma what to make an ordered pair? Well, we'd be going up 1, 2, 3, right? So that would be 3. That's our y value. That's our h of x value. So we can say that h of negative 6 is 3. So let's try that again. Oops. For some reason my eraser's not working. There we go. So the second one says h of negative 1, which means that x is going to equal what? Negative 1. So I want to go, here's 0. Do I want to go to the left or to the right one space? We want to go to the left because we're talking about negative. So we're going to go to the left one space, and I'm going to look all along this vertical line for where the graph crosses. The graph crosses right here. What's the y value there? We went down 2 spaces to get there, so that means that's a negative 2. So we can say that h of negative 1 is negative 2. Why don't you try the last one? Evaluate h of 6. So this time we want to move to the left or to the right. We're going to go to the right because we're talking about positives. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm looking all along that point, and I find it right there. What's the output value there? It's 3. So we can say that h of 6 equals 3. And it's okay that these outputs repeat. It's still a function. It's just if our inputs repeat, right? So keep that in mind. But that's it. We just evaluated 3 different types of functions, 3 different representations of functions. So now let's look at what's called a piecewise function. So they're asking us to evaluate 2 different pieces here. It says h of 2, and then h of 5. And look at what our function says. We have these restraints right here. So what this is saying is that if x is less than 5, we want to use this function. But if x is greater than or equal to 5, we want to use this function. So h of 2. Do I want to use the top function or the bottom function? Yeah, 2 is less than 5, right? So that would be this one, which means we want to use the negative 2x plus 1. And we're substituting what value? 2. So negative 2 times 2 is negative 4 plus 1, which would make negative 3. So h of 2 is 3. Negative 3, I'm sorry. Now, how about for the second one? Do I want to use the top or the bottom equation? Well, 5 is greater than or equal to 5, right? So we want to use that bottom equation. So we're going to say x squared plus 3. But what am I plugging in for x? 5. 5 squared is 25. 25 plus 3 is 28. So we can say that h of 5 equals 28. So the really big piece you got to remember on this one is to pay attention to these constraints right here and make sure you know whether or not a number is greater than or less than another number. Really important. So the last one we have here, we're going to compare several different values and 3 different functions. If you look, we've got f of x, we've got g of x, and we've got h of x. So you've got to pay attention to what it's asking you to evaluate. Okay? So if we look at this first example down here, it says we're comparing f of 1 to g of 0. So f of 1, do I want to use f of x, g of x, or h of x? I want to use f of x because it has an f at the beginning. So we're going to go up here and simplify for f of 1, which means we're plugging in what value? 1. So I'm going to say a negative 1 squared plus 7. 1 squared is 1. Bring down the negative and the plus 7. We get a 6. So f of 1 is 6. I'm just going to put a little 6 right below there. Then I'm going to go look at what function in order to evaluate g of 0, f of x, g of x, or h of x. We're going to use g of x because it had a g in there. And we're looking for x to equal what value? 0. So I'm looking down my x column. Here I found 0. So what's my value? 7. Good. Okay, so now we've got to compare this. Is 6 greater than 7? Is 6 less than 7? Or is 6 equal to 7? 6 is less than 7. If you have a hard time remembering greater than or less than, I like to think about less than, if I were to kind of straighten that out, makes an L. Versus greater than is like the hook of a G. It's a real simple way to try to remember that. Okay, so let's try the next one. I've got g of negative 2. So which function do I want to use? F of x, g of x, or h of x? It's got a g in there, so we want to use g of x. I'm looking for x to equal what value? Negative 2. So I'm going to go to g of x. I'm going to look in my x column for the value of negative 2. What's my output value? 6. Great, so the second part, I'm looking for h of negative 4. So which function do I want to look at? F of x, g of x, or h of x? H of x, which is the graph. Am I going to go up 4, right 4, down 4, or left 4? Left 4, because we're talking about an x value and it's negative. So if I go over 1, 2, 3, 4, I've got to find where it hits the graph, which is right here. What's my y value? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's a negative 5. So is 6 greater than negative 5, less than negative 5, or equal to negative 5? 6 is greater than negative 5. Good job. Okay, let's try the last one. Why don't you evaluate f of 3 and tell me what you get? Well, if we take 3 and we plug it into the f of x function, we get a negative 3 squared plus 7. That makes a negative 9 plus 7. The 9 is negative because it's on the outside of that parentheses. All of that makes a negative 2. So I know that this is a negative 2. Okay, now evaluate the h of 6 and tell me what you get. So h of negative 6 means we're going over 6 spaces to the left. And then we find where the graph crosses, which is right here. So it's down 1 space, which makes negative 1. So now tell me, is f of 3 going to be greater than, less than, or equal to h of negative 6? I know this is negative numbers we're dealing with, and that can be kind of confusing. Remember, you kind of have to think backwards. So negative 2 is actually less than negative 1. Go ahead and move on to your practice and try some of those problems with evaluating functions.